Okay, this is a video on. Oh God, this is a video on behavioral genetics and genetics, the details on the genetics regarding the gods and goddesses. Um, so I'm going to get into detailed genetics here. Uh, it should be interesting. Um, a lot of this information is not available to the public, not because it's secret, but because just because it's well, my the source I'm getting it from is ultimately unique. Although anyone could probably get it. I guess it seems unique to me, the source, but truly it's more. Okay, so let's talk about halves and wholes and how half a half represents a whole as a whole half. Now, if you count from the number one, you count up to 12. So let's say there's 12 signs of the zodiac, and you would count the first half. Then that's number one, the first half. Then number two is the second half. So now you have two halves. Now you get into the third house of Gemini, and you have a third. Now the third is not a third half. There's only two halves. So when we count our whole numbers in mathematics, starting with one, and we count like a one as a one, well, it's not really. See, for the understanding of the genetics, if we're going to look at the actual genetics themselves, the actual under a microscope, we're going to look and see what these functions are, what these variables are. We're gonna see a first half, a second half, and then we're going to see a third, which is incorporating the two halves. Now, the two halves can be incorporated into the second house. So let's look at 12 houses and understand there's 12 positions. So if you're in the first position, you're not in the second position. And if you're in the second position, it can include the first, but it's not in the first position. So we look at the first half and see that it's impossible that a first half can, unless it's a whole number. So understand that in the first house, the one can exist as a half, and also it can exist as a whole number. And now, what does this mean spiritually in the sense of the profoundness of the nature of the understanding? Well, let's just say that if it's a whole number, it's got power, spiritual power, and if it's just a half, it's missing the other half. So whatever spiritual power it has is designed around not having the other half. Now that could be good and bad. So the halves can be empowered as deities, and if they're empowered as deities as a half, then they're considered to be whole as a half, but they're halves, they're not wholes. So let's say there's masculine and feminine. And so, how we're going to distinguish understanding the first half from the second half is the first half, we'll say, is masculine or it's a singularity. It gets with the second half in the second house. Now, the second half is in the second house, and it could accept the first half into the second house with it. Now there's two halves in the second house or the second position. Now, if the first half stays in the first position, then it's not going to get into the second position. And if the second position or the second half doesn't take the first half into its position in the second place, then the second half will be stuck being a half by it. Like a first half, the second half will be alone in the second house in the second position and still just a half. See? So what has to take place, the most important thing has to take place for anything to even be counted, for numbers to be even counted up. Like you can't even count unless these variables move in the right way, unless they cooperate and do the right things. The first half has to move into the second house or the second position. So it has to move out of the first position to get into the second position. Now you have two halves in the second position. Now in the second position, you can look at the two halves as just together and in the same house. They're not one. They're two different halves that are in the second position as together. Now we're going to understand that as two $1 bills sitting together, like two $1 bills. You place them in the second house, there'll be a $1 bill. They're both separate $1 bills. They're not together, other than they're in the same house together. So if you put two $1 bills and you say the first $1 bill is the first half, the second $1 bill is the second half, and you put them together in the second position, now you have two halves in the second position. And now if they come together in what's called a coupling, they have to become one. And if they come into a coupling, they'll wind around each other. It's called a double helix, and it's called a coupling. It's required for conception. All life on Earth, or all human conception, has to absolutely follow two laws, which may not be otherwise. You have to do two things in order to conceive, for the fetus to be even able to be starting to be developed. There's two laws that have to be met, or requirements. And one is the coupling of two strands of DNA. And the other is the information sharing of those two strands of DNA when they do what's called first the coupling, and then a line by line sharing of information when they start what's called protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is when the two halves are together in the second house, and now they couple, they become one. So they're no longer two $1 bills, they become one $2 bill. So imagine a $2 bill sitting in, I take these two $1 bills out of the second position and I put one $2 bill there. And now I say, okay, that $2 bill is worth $2, but it's only one $2 bill. It's not two. It's not two things separate. It's one thing, and they're the same one thing. So the $2 bill represents a coupling, achieved coupling of two $1 bills. It becomes one $2 bill. And now sitting in the second house, that $2 bill is considered coupled. Now it is primed to do what's called start conception. Now conception is just the moment where it becomes the $2 bill. So if I told you that $1 bills can't conceive when they're separate, they have to become $2 bills. Well, when they do, they are considered coupled. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a $2 bill there. And if it is a $2 bill, it did achieve coupling. And what it does is now what's called DNA sequencing. DNA sequencing is where the coupled two strands of DNA, they share a line for line instruction and start protein synthesis, which is the creation of the fetus. So the fetus is created in a time period that is just a short period of time. So in a 9-month cycle of being born, in a birth cycle of 9 months, your crucial parts of your development are had, or to be had, only during the certain times. So out of 9 months, most of that time, the fetus has already been developed. And it's just, they're almost the whole 9 months, the fetus is already there. It's just growing. So there's a critical time where the fetus is actually being created. And during the created moments, there's the most critical moments, because they can't not share line for line. And if they don't share properly, then there'll be what's called genetic disorders. Instructions for protein synthesis to create genetic disorders are all the genetic disorders that we get are stored in well, they're stored mostly in nuclear chromosomes, but all genetic disorders there's instructions on how to create them. Now, these instructions were put there by whoever God is. So basically, you can't get a genetic disorder by just it happening by accident, or even by it's just natural occurrence of naturally, because a genetic disorder doesn't occur naturally, not ever, not even one time. All genetic disorders come from programming, what's called bioprogramming, and their line for line instructions are in there to create the genetic disorder should the fetal development go wrong. For whatever reason, the fetal development might go wrong, that they're not sharing information line for line. Each strand has exactly half. So understand that the nuclear strand of DNA representing the first half in a man's testicles is unpaired. So it comes from the 23rd pair of chromosomes. And so understand, when we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, we really don't. We do have 23 pairs, but we don't have 23 pairs. We have 22 pairs that are called autosomes that are all after conception, meaning there are two types of chromosomes which are unpaired, and they are not allowed to exist in an unpaired state, which means all chromosomes are not allowed to exist unpaired, or they're considered germs or bacteria, and the immune system destroys them. So singularity, for the most part, is had through the third domain, and ultimately singularity is had in the third. After the two halves get together, they become a first and the third. So understand that singularity can be very confusing when you think that it can come from different places. It's singularity, but when it comes from in the third place, it's a first place and the third place from the two halves coming together. It's now a singularity in the third as a first, rather than in the first as a half or a whole. And understand that in the singularity in the first place could be a half or a whole. Now, okay, so what we're looking at here is the conditions for human life, to even be able to have it. And so what we're looking at is whoever God is, and he's the one who told me this. All this information I got is from God. So basically, at one time it might have been from a divine feminine who also helped me, but ultimately it's from God, as I'll tell you. If I thought that it was from a divine feminine, I'm being told maybe I was mistaken. It was actually, I thought it was the divine feminine telling me, but it was more like a divine masculine telling me that was maybe letting me believe. But that's not even important right now, because we're bringing the two together is the whole point here. It's not about one over the other, against the other. You can't have the two against each other. They won't be able to survive. They won't be able to live. They can't come into life. So ultimately, all genetic disorders are had on purpose. And that means that there's no such thing as an accidental genetic disorder. It's under a bioprogramming that is already put there, which means God placed all the genetic disorders in the cells to be able the information on how to create the diseases. All the diseases are created not by accident, but on purpose. Well, they're thought to be by accident, but ultimately they're not only on purpose, but they're for specific exact reasons. The triggers for not sharing information, and each one has half, and understand that there's two strands of DNA that have to come together: a mitochondrial strand in the woman's ovaries, which is a singularity. It's from the 23rd pair of chromosomes in our body, but it's not a pair. It's not paired until after conception. So all of the chromosomes that we have in our body that are autosomes, including the first 22 pairs, are already paired, and they don't come before conception, which means the first two chromosomes to come together are the 23rd pair, and they're actually not paired until they couple first and then start DNA sequencing, and each one has half. So each one has half the instructions on how to create the fetus. Now understand that each one does not possess more than half exactly of the instructions, line for line instructions on how to create the brain, how to create the big toe. Like they'll take turns. So it'll like do this. It'll be once they do the coupling, then they do the DNA sequencing and share instructions. It's making a line for line instructions on building the body itself, the fetus itself, the fetal development is occurring in what's called protein synthesis. It's a creation of flesh and bone and brain and all the parts of your body. Um, the details here and the what's profound about it is to understand that whoever God is, well, God is God, but truly you can't see God even when he's talking to you. So you can only know what he's claiming he is, and ultimately, having faith, you won't see God literally. You might hear him in your head talking to you, but at least I do. Even I don't hear him in my head talking. That's a different story. I have to actually do what's called authentication on where I use my hands and type up stuff. Um, so the 23rd pair gets paired, and it starts the fetal development. And if they each with their half the instructions on how to create the fetus, if they share, and it's made so that they have to share because each one only has half the instructions. One side doesn't know how to make the other side of the body, so that the two sides of your brain, the right side that controls the left side of your body, and the left brain that controls the right side of your body, is made in that the right side is creating the left side of the body in the fetus. That's from the right chromosome, or it could be his or hers. I don't know which one's right or left. It could switch, but ultimately there's two of them. One's a mitochondrial strand, and one's a what's called a nuclear strand. See, sperm is not a anything but a fish. So a sperm is a fish that is holding a singular strand of nuclear DNA on top of its head. So the brain of the sperm is basically not really a brain. It's actually a fish, a little swim fish, that is holding a new singular strand of nuclear DNA that's taking it to the other singular strand of mitochondrial DNA in the ovary. Um, all of the first 22 pairs which we get will be had after the 23rd pair couples, or it might be the first pair, which means the first pair, the 23rd pair may be the first pair actually, or it ends up being the 23rd, but it has to pair first for any of the autosomes to come. Now there is a law that in the body, which is from coming from what are called mitochondria in your body. Mitochondria are they are responsible for burning fat, and they're responsible for uh, killing singularity in the body. So killing germs, killing. They're all responsible for all cellular breakdown of decay, cellular decay, bio decay. Meaning that the mitochondria in your body are a singularity that comes from the third position, using the first two halves as a third. So it's kind of like a Gemini, and they're they're little creatures in your body. Now we ended up getting these creatures or these things called mitochondria showed up in us when we became multicellular organisms, and the singular celled organisms are like bacteria, viruses. Mostly all forms of bacteria are single celled organisms. They're also asexual, meaning they only have one parent. They produce on their own. Dad has kids, and they're all look like him. They're all boys. They're never girls. So basically, that's why you have two forms of the bacteria. There's two forms of bacteria, and I'll say that ultimately people will not believe a lot of what I got to say because it's wow. People just say, "Where'd you get this information?" God told me, and I'm happy to share whatever I can. Um, I I used to have a big kind of idea that I could get the divine feminine into a powerful position in this world again, and help her, and through understanding, there she'll be able to realize that she may not be coming back the way she wants to come back, and what that means is that the way she wants to come back are well. This is all that we're talking about here. This will all be necessary to understand for for every kind of any understanding. This is the understanding you need that I'm sharing here with you. You need to know about what I'm talking about and understand it and have a full understanding of it for you to understand anything in this world, and that goes for everything in this world. Which means God told me that if you don't have this simple understanding about life and about how things work, then nothing could be understood really by you. Like you'll fail to see all of it because basically everything is in this whole world is designed after conception and comes in after the conceiving of a life, which means that nothing comes in after conception that is following conception that that is singularity that's allowed. So only singularity that is allowed before conception as a half is allowed. So we're going to talk about that. So first of all, I'll skip around here and um, I'm going to talk about some of these things. So this is going to be a very skipped around video. So I'm going to skip around because I'm going to hit a lot of topics and try to cover all the important stuff. Um, okay, so there is a lot to know about the Alamo and the Alamo being a place where in Texas there was a stand where many men died and ultimately defending the Alamo from the Mexicans. That's the story God tells me a lot. So he brings that up to me, and ultimately, I've always wanted to talk to him, and I never had the chance until recently. So I'm very much honored and glad that he's willing to talk to me. And I didn't know if he existed. So basically, only less than a year now that I've been actually thinking that I'm talking to God, and He's talking to me. Well, He's here with me right now. So Yeah, I talked to him right before I started this video, and he told me what we're going to talk about. So basically, everything I'm talking about is what he wants me to say. Um, I always wanted to feel important and do something important, and I always wanted to have a purpose and some kind of important purpose. And I was never happy about not really having an important purpose. Like I just didn't want to be a regular anybody. Like I was just like, wow, I got to do something more than just. So I strove to try to literally I went for the top. Like what can I do that's just spectacular in this world when I leave it? I want to have left this world and have helped humanity in many ways, understand some new things. Um, I never thought I was going to be able to do any of this really for real, and it's taken me so long to be able to get as far as I have, and ultimately I've gotten pretty far. It's just a matter of see the whole point is it's not about how popular we can become with each other, and ultimately it is if we want to if we can certainly it's nice, but we're not here to please each other and ultimately ourselves. We're here to please God and follow God and prove that we can. Um, it's not easy because the half that God is, and God told me that He's a half, a first half, and that she could be considered a second half from the second place. But there is a singularity that exists as masculine or feminine in the first house as a first half, and only one goddess has met those requirements, and that's Athena. Athena is the only goddess that's a god because she actually comes from her dad Zeus, which means that when you look at the old mythological goddesses, you'll find that there are Minerva, Hera, Artemis. Those are the ones that will be the ones that I see the most. And let's see, Minerva, Hera, Artemis, Athena, and Diana. So Minerva being the biggest player, I think Minerva and Artemis was a big player, but Minerva was probably the biggest player of all. The Athena was actually a man god coming to you. So understand that if you were to see Athena, the goddess, come towards you, you'd think she was a god. You wouldn't, if you didn't see her skirt and she's wearing a woman showing you, if you didn't see nothing, you would definitely not think it was a woman coming to you. So you would mistake Athena, the presence of Athena. Well, she could show you her femininity, but she doesn't have any really. She's your dad. Um, and ultimately, that's what the story says in the mythological sense of her coming straight from her dad Zeus's forehead. So in mythological uh, history, um, Zeus, the god, father god of all gods, had a headache one day, and he asked Hephaestus, one of the gods of the forge, to take a hammer and smash his head open because he had to get to whatever was in it that was giving him a headache. And Athena jumped out. His daughter Athena jumped out of his head in full armor and ready to fight with the sword and everything. So you now understand that people look at that story in the mythological sense as that can't be true. Obviously, like you don't have like a god doesn't have a headache one day and then pull a full armored daughter out of his forehead. And how could he smash his own head open or ask his buddy to? Ultimately, because the mythological understandings are had to be had as an analogy in a symbolic way. So the understanding that anything's true about the mythological sense that Zeus had a headache one day and inside his head was his daughter coming out of it. Well, Athena was born from her father and had no mother. So basically, if she did have a mother, no. So whoever's Athena's mother is ultimately not in her goddess godness. So which would just mean she didn't have a mother. She came from asexual Zeus uh, coming. So Zeus was the father and mother of Athena. So that daughter came out, ended up replacing Eris. But the half is what we're talking about here, the first half. See, the first half, if it's a god, it's actually it's a whole. It's not. It's a whole number that's a half. It defies all the mathematics, the laws of mathematics. Because understand that if you have a half, it's a first half. That's not the second half. You could have it before conception or after conception. And when if the first half is had before conception, then it's not with the second half, which means there probably isn't even a second half there. But if the second and first get together, they don't have to become one. They could just work together and stay separate. And so therefore the two halves are still halves, even though they're together. And they could also do what's called a coupling if they actually conceive and start fetal development. So but then they have to become one. Actually, they can't be two separate things. So you don't have two fetuses being developed. You only have one fetus being developed. So understand, if there were two fetuses being developed, one from mom and one from dad, you'd have twins. Everybody would be twins. One would be a boy, one would be a girl. But understand, because of the fact of the law. So what we're looking at here is the law. God made it so that you can't come into this world unless you're paired, coupled up first. And it has to be a proper coupling and checked. And then you have to share information, or the baby gets punished with genetic disorders. So basically, what I would tell you is that I'm of the understanding that all genetic disorders are a punishment to be carried out under a set of circumstances, which are they don't share information once they're trying to develop the fetus. It's strange to think that two strands of DNA, one might not want to share information with the other, but understand that the instinctual behavior of behavioral genetics says that genes behave in particular ways which are not logical, meaning genetic behavior itself is almost stereotypical of not logical at all, because emotions aren't logical. And when emotions drive genetics, and they can, meaning that your emotional state of mind can drive your genetic behavior, which means that your genes will act in accordance with your emotional frame of mind. Also, their disposition, so they can not be in cooperation with each other, and disposition against each other. So the genes could work against each other and try to destroy each other. They could ultimately not cooperate with each other. They could hang out and kind of cooperate, but not really become one. There's so many different ways that the behavioral genetics indicate that humans come out in so many different ways, healthy or any degree of not healthy. The half that's had by as a Zeus or a father god is a whole, but it's only his half. It's his whole. It's actually a whole, and it's before conception, meaning that the only place that a half can exist as a whole is before conception, because it exists as a deity. And so figure Zeus is not a half. He's a whole father god. But the thing is that his half from the whole father god gets with her half from the woman or the goddess, and Hera would be in the case of Zeus and Hera. And so the two halves that become what humans are made of come straight from the god and goddess themselves. And ultimately, the goddess and the gods themselves are wholes as halves, and they exist before human conception because they're actually deities. They're not human, so they're not going to come into this world. There's no requirement on them. So Zeus will behave like a half and seem to be a half, but that's because he's his half. It's a whole. But understand that he's allowed to be half as a whole, and claim he could be his half only, and he doesn't have to be her half, and he doesn't have to do any sharing with her, and Zeus doesn't have to do any coupling with her or sharing with her. Understand that if you're looking at the behavioral genetics of the spirit of the deity as a half, his whole, or her half, her whole, you're going up to the top, where Hera, the goddess, and Zeus, the god, were god and goddess. And there's no requirements on the god and goddess to have to share or become one or share information, so they don't get a genetic disorder, because they won't. There's not going to be any punishment given out to the god and goddess for how they behave, because they can behave any way they want, and they do. So what you have to know here is that the behavior that comes from all the human race, it's coming from halves that come from a divine place, even though they're in humans. And once the halves that are if they're going to come, they start as coming into this world. If they're going to be conceived as a human being that's actually can be real, then those two halves have to get together and have to share information and have to couple, or they may not come into this world. Or if they couple, they have to couple, or they may not come into this world. But if they actually couple, they can come to this world now, and only because they couple, which means it's an absolute. If you don't couple with her half, you may not be alive. You will not conceive. There's no protein. It's just going to happen. There's no fetal development going to ever happen. It's a miscarriage. So understand, all miscarriages are because of a failure to couple between the two strands, which would, and then no miscarriages are by accident either. If a woman has a miscarriage, it's on purpose all the time, every time. It's a rejection of the fetus for not coupling correctly. Or it's also possible that during fetal development, it was not sharing information at all, which means that it's rejected utterly as a blob of flesh, maybe only one sided, because only one parent was actually doing the creation. But yes, you'll be missing legs and arms on that fetus. So now we have an understanding that the behavior that comes from the father god and mother goddess Hera and Zeus. It's important to know that that's where the behavior comes from, and they're allowed to be wholes as halves. So now that the human race is using those halves that are wholes, they're not going to be able to be whole when they conceive. So those two halves have to share, couple together, and then share information. Absolutely, and ultimately the fetus gets punished for whatever amount of information doesn't get shared. The severity of a genetic disorder will be conducive to every part of how much they're actually willing to share. So what I'm suggesting to you is that when those two halves that couple become during fetal development, they are actually acting out a mentality of a goddess and god that are going to potentially become a life. And the goddess and god that are potentially going to become a life are two strands of DNA that only have half their instructions to create that. They have to work together. And it was made so that if under any degree they don't work together, there's going to be a punishment of some kind. Those are all genetic disorders. Genetic disorders happen during fetal development, and then they may happen during lifetime after being born, but genetic disorders are all things that happen during fetal development. And of course, doctors might disagree, and I don't know the details on how science agrees with that or not. But what I would tell you is that genetic disorders are all a fact, even if you have them later in life. You had them when you were born; they were created when you were born during development. And so maybe when you're 60, if you get a genetic disorder coming out, well, you got it when you were born. And ultimately, if it does come becoming asymptomatic or not asymptomatic, it becomes symptomized, so that you actually get symptoms. Now, the Alamo and the idea of the purpose of human behavior and how it is a cause for conflict in this world. Like all of our conflicts are had the last 3,000 years of war that we've had. Well, we have war all the time, and we don't have a relaxing or a cessation in conflicts ever, which means that the human race as a whole is in conflict forever. Now, it just happens to be a fact that there's no such place where there's no wars happening all the time, and on Earth, the human spirit is in conflict 24/7, 365. And so it's acting out its anger, it's acting out its issues somewhere on Earth in some form, from small to huge. All the wars that we have are based upon the same problems, and they're all old problems, and they're all problems that are new and old and always repeating, which means that human conflict is had as a result of our insistence on following a design which comes from a deity or a god or a half that's a whole. It doesn't have to follow coupling law or sharing information. So the humans have to do it, or they can't be born. And ultimately, sharing information is not required for birth or to conceive. If you don't want to share information, it's just a matter of you'll get sick somehow. So basically, to the degree you don't share information is to the degree of the severity of the genetic disorder. And I'm just suggesting that's exactly how it works. Meaning, whoever God was that was literally creating us, He wanted the two things to happen. One, He knew already that the way He is, and his like, imagine Zeus, the God and Father of all gods, Jehovah. He wanted humans to survive under, and He created those humans in His image, and they're going to have His spirit and be like Him and feel like what He feels, and they'll react in their own way. So the way that God created us was He said, I know that whatever conflicts I might have in my head will be what you have in your head, conflicts in your head. So what I'm going to do is require two requirements for life to even be able to be alive. One of them is that two strands of DNA have to do an absolute perfect coupling. That means they have to come together and be like a husband and wife that are in one marriage, not boyfriend and girlfriend. So he would say that boyfriends and girlfriends cannot live on Earth. They won't. You're not allowed to be alive if you're just going to have a girlfriend. You have to have a wife, and you have to be married to her. And I'm going to check to make sure you guys are. There's one marriage there. It's a coupling of spirit. So you can get a spiritual coupling, and when you have two people in one marriage, it's not two marriages. So understand that marriage is a result of two people coming together and they become one marriage. Husband and wife become one entity. It's one entity, not two. And it's basically what happens when the god and goddess get together and do their coupling and do their information sharing, and they're getting along. Now understand why the two won't get along. It's always because of information sharing. And he'd say that Hera is keeping secrets, and she doesn't tell me everything all the time, so I don't tell her either everything. So we're talking about the largest absolute reason for conflict in this world are based upon two principles. One, honest coupling. That means if two strands of DNA try to pretend to couple so they can become a life, do you think that's possible? It's not. Which means that let's say that two strands of DNA that were coming to this world by a man in his testicles, he gets with her strand in the ovaries, they come together. Let's say that they say, well, we just want to be alive and become alive, be allowed to live. So we're gonna couple and be like, hi, how are you doing? Let's couple. Okay, that's a great idea. But understand that if it's not real, a real coupling end up being a miscarriage, absolute miscarriage. So the body will reject it as a miscarriage because it doesn't couple correctly. It can't pretend. It has to be an honest coupling that's real. And so, and then the next one is sharing of information. So I want to say that the two reasons for conflict in this world, the absolute two reasons for all conflict and all problems in this world are sharing information and and faking couplings where I get with my wife, but it's not really real. I'm just getting some money out of her or whatever I can. Or when the marriages happen, they're not real. Then they're considered not allowed, which meant that imagine if they checked your marriage to see if it was real and then said you can't be with your wife unless it's an actual real one entity, and it has to be not in conflict because they'll become into one entity in a marriage and then be in conflict, which means that you don't want to create a marriage entity that's actually fighting itself and other things. It's a creation of an entity which is bad or fights. It would be considered a reject and thrown away or killed, destroyed. Um, Sometimes the failure to be able to achieve a coupling by the fact that one of the sides of the um, DNA is sorry, excuse me for a second. Okay, so genes that are required to fight after conception, to undo false entities or entities that are created after entities are created after conception, it's too late, which means that, wow. Okay. Well, I actually didn't know about that. I'm not surprised though. Okay, so what I'm being told is that after creating an entity that is wow, is that for real? Wow. Okay, sorry. Man, oh man. Um, Creation of an entity after conception. Now, let's say, is it possible that entity was created before conception? That's what I want to ask. No. For the sake of understanding, it's no. Um, So, because the reason why I'm going to ask that is if an entity that's a bad entity was created, it would have to have happened after the conception, which meant whatever gods and goddess existed. Wow, unbelievable, man! Oh man. Okay, this is just insight that I've not seen myself, not until right this minute. So I'm just like, wow, this explains bad entities. They're ultimately like a husband and wife that takes their time, a husband and wife that creates an entity, a marriage entity that's like against each other, hates each other, and ultimately the entity gets created. It becomes alive. So before the human race was created, there was no entities that were bad, other than to say that the gods and goddesses were separate before conception, and they were not required to couple or share information. So there was no law on the gods and goddesses to have to share information with each other. There was no law on having to require the gods and goddesses to couple and make it a real coupling, and who's going to check it, because gods and goddesses can do whatever they want. They don't have to share information, and they don't have to couple. And so they are can walk around like with their mentality, like, yeah, I don't have to share information with you, and I'm a god or I'm a goddess. Like ultimately that they were not subjected to any of the requirements we are, but we're actually required to these requirements as the first two requirements to even be able to come into this world. So that God created humans as a result of mixing his own DNA with his and hers, and ultimately, it's basically humans are trying to solve the problem of dispute between the gods and goddesses of old. Now, the entities that are created, and this is really interesting, the entities created that came in after the human race was started. That's important to mention. Excuse me for a second here. Wow, man, oh man. Um, the bad entities, which are ruling this world now, are responsible for most of the conflict we're in, and they like bad entities, like real evil ones or bad ones. So I was not even aware till this very hour, this very minute. I was not truly aware of what I just discovered, and what I was just came to realize is I'm being told that the entities which are bad, the evil ones in this world that are ruling and fighting and in conflict everywhere, were created after the human race was created, and not before. They did not exist before the human race was created, because all that existed before the human race was created was gods and goddesses, which were separate and allowed to be separate and didn't have to share information or couple. And then once they created the human race, they created people that would have to come together in at least those two ways to even be allowed to exist, to even come out the womb. And ultimately, it's also suggesting that there's a punishment for not sharing information. If you ask me, that what I'd say is that we're not supposed to share all information. Certainly, God doesn't tell all secrets, and He doesn't say that we should be sharing all information with each other. There's lots of information we're not going to share. That's what they have top secret for. But understand that He's also saying that there's lots of information that we don't share that we should be sharing, that would actually benefit everyone if we did share it, and it's benefiting no one because we don't share it. And it's also okay. So this is one of the things. Wow, man, oh man. I say wow and man, oh man at the same time for some reason. Yeah, they both count. And Unbelievable. So the entities that are now the ruling entities in this world are coming from after human conception, and they're as a result of the human race being problematic, coming together. It's not coming together. Too many secrets, too many withholding information. Like I said, we can't give all the secrets away, but we need to share a lot more information. That's part of our conflict. Is what we don't know hurts us. What we don't know kills us. What we don't know is the big problem. And when in the coupling, where human race is all about a false coupling. If it suits you for money or purposes, for anything you can get, like to create like a attitude like you'll get along with others when you really don't want to, it's called a false coupling. And ultimately you're not allowed to exist. If you make a false coupling, it's a miscarriage every time. So God told me that there's no such thing as an accidental miscarriage. All miscarriages are failure to couple, ejected, reject pile, thrown out of the body. So there's no accidental miscarriages. Also, human pregnancies are as a result of whether you get pregnant or not, as a result of how easily the coupling. You can't get pregnant if you're not going to couple with him, or your strand is not going to share. Then you will never get pregnant. So women that have pregnancy problems, they have probably their, you can bet that they're women that will be set against their husbands in many ways, which will reflect the behavioral genetics, why you can't conceive somehow and don't know. It's about acceptance, loving each other and accepting each other to the death, trusting each other to the death, trusting each other completely. These entities that were created after human conception were created as a result of the problems that resulted from the attempt of whatever God and Goddess was doing at the time they created the human race, and ultimately it's God. So let's not even mention Goddess. Let's say that it's God. Well, ultimately, the Bible says there's one God, and I agree. But there's actually more than one God. But the entity is one entity, so it's made of multiple entities. This is information just important to know that it seems contradictory to there's a lot of information coming in my head right now, and I'm just trying to figure out what I want to share and what's the most important to share. Um, okay, you want me to share this? Poor people are not allowed in society, and society is not accepting applications for employment into the human race. It makes it so each society will have different warring factors for reasons why they'll fight a society in a civil strife. Each society will fight civilly or in a civil strife depending on what it's doing with its poor populations, which are not allowed to be in society. Basically, if you're poor, you're not allowed to be in the society. You're not included, and you're not allowed. Now, how? So I would ask God. I would want to ask God if that's true. Then understand that. Um, is it supposed to be that there's some poor that shouldn't be allowed, or is it just that that's a problem? So are there poor that should not be allowed in society? Yes. So there's poor people that should not be allowed in society. So we need to force people to be poor that aren't allowed in society. But the ones that should be allowed to get back into society, oh man, oh man. Okay. See, what I'm being told is that the ones that are supposed to be back in society, many of them, they need to be able to get back in society somehow, and everything could be gained. And ultimately, uh, there's the ruling factors are for who joins a society or who gets out or who's going to be in society or not, are the ruling entities, which are bad ruling entities. So when I say bad, I don't want to characterize this in the wrong way. So I want to be very cautious and careful to tell you that I don't see anything wrong with bad entities. I see that. Well, I mean, what is bad? So let's define that. Because when you say bad entities, what does that really mean? Bad entities are entities that are willing to be bad, but are not necessarily bad and may be good. So an entity that's bad, if you quote unquote call it a bad entity, what you're saying is that it is an entity that might be good, actually, and not bad. but it is capable of being bad at any time for any reason and in probably bad ways. So the entity that was created after the human race is a specific entity called God of this world. So, God of this world is an entity that was created after this world was created and not before this world was created. So, what I'm being told is that he did not exist, and I'm almost certainly that's true. Yes, he did not exist. The entity that's called God of this world did not exist for this world. He came in after this world, after humans were coming in as a human race, and then conflict started. So the entity created was a entity that was doing a real bonding or coupling that was genuine in a society of separated in conflict people that were characterizing gods and goddesses which were not forced to couple with each other, so could be against each other in every behavioral way. So the gods and goddesses that came into this world or that were here long ago were entities that were separate, and the divine feminine and masculine was always separate from. So if you imagine divine feminine and masculine as separate from each other, well, they are not separate anymore, what I'm being told. Not entirely, it's complicated, but what I want you to know is that when you mix masculine and feminine and you have a left and right brain, they're both if I have two sides of my brain, it's if one side's feminine and one side's masculine, well, it could be that they're mixed. But if I said they're still separate, they are still separate, but they're mixed. And the gods and goddesses didn't have mixed. They'd have them separate, and they were not mixed, and then separate. They were not mixed and not separate, or excuse me, not mixed and absolutely separate. So the entity that was created here was the God of this world, or is the God of this world. It's the entity here now ruling over this world, and he is not a she. He's not a she. That's what he says, but he is coupled as an entity with her, which means that when he says he's not a she, he's a he God entity, which has done a spiritual coupling with the divine feminine entity, and ultimately he's become one with her in a genuine way, not to be ingenuine. So understand that when you're looking, one of the important things. Wow, man, oh man. See, one of the absolute things to be aware here is that the God of this world is saying that he was not here before this world, before humanity was here. He came in after as a God that's now ruling over Earth in a conflict. All the conflicts we have on Earth are as a result of a God that we have, the God of this world. And says well, truly, what does he say? He's bad to the bone. And ultimately, if he says that means that I could be bad, and I will be bad. I'll be the worst. Think of anything terribly catastrophic and destructive coming right from me, including destroying an entire world all at once by flooding it. Um, wow, pretty powerful and scary when you think about it, because he says um, he's not bad, other than to say that if he is bad, it's because he's doing what God does when he's whoever else calls him bad. He can be bad on purpose. He will do it. So everything he's doing is for a purpose, on purpose, with a purpose. And now what we have to understand is what happened to all the gods and goddesses before uh, before the entity that's ruling this world, the evil entity that's ruling this world. That yeah, that's why we have conflicts, people, and disease and cancer and everything. And understand the conflicts will never end. The diseases never end. The plagues never end. None of it will ever end, because the God of this world says, I've created all the plagues. There'll be another one if I create another one. Certainly there'll be many more, but they're not going away. The cancer doesn't get to get cured. Otherwise, it would have been cured a long time ago. People have to suffer and die. Ultimately, that's pretty intensely crazy to think wow, he's a scary God. You'd be afraid of him and terrified, utterly. And I remember sitting behind a tree when I first talked to God, and he was talking to me. I literally have only been having any kind of conversation with God for less than a year, and it's not audible in my head usually, which means I can't hear what he's saying in my head. I have to write down on a piece of paper. I have to look at letters to see what letter he wants me to look at, so he can make my eyes look at a letter. Or I'll look at something, he could make me look at it. He could also move my hands. So my hand will move by itself and tap a letter. I could tap out letters on the keyboard, which or him, he could talk to me on the keyboard. I'm not really great at it yet, on the keyboard especially. But on one of the, here's what I should show you what I talked to him with. This is a letterboard, and this is how I talk to him. And ultimately, it's a way that I could look at letters. And so if he wants to say a word to me, I look at the letter, that's the first letter of the word, and I usually then know what the word is. So I could just look at a bunch of first letters to first words, and I won't know what the word is until I look at the letter. So if it starts with D for Dennis, well, if I look at a D and then I know it's Dennis, you're saying Dennis. Or so usually I could tell what the word is just by looking at the first letter. But I have to do this ultimately with practice, and ultimately it's not easy, and I can't do it without the letterboard all the time. Like if I'm trying to talk to God and I don't have some letters to look at, then I'll tell him like, I'm not sure what you're saying, but if I think you're saying, so when I'm talking to God, I'm like, God, I think you're telling me this. But I'm not sure about it. So he'll tell me that you're right, because there's a feminine entity in you that's trying to confuse you and doesn't want you to understand. So understand the struggle, the behavioral conflict that we're having as a human race is had that we can't even talk to God, because understand that the entity, which is the genuinely coupled with her, is also responsible for punishing the entire human race. And understand the importance of the genuineness of the coupling. Understand that to have a false coupling, like on purpose, maybe you pretend like you're with somebody, but you're not really with them. When you're talking physically with them or not, you can't really fake it, right? But understand, you could hug someone and say you're with them, and now you're one. But ultimately, if there has to be an entity that's the judge of that. So there has to be an entity that says, I want to see if humans are coupling it correctly. And then that I'm going to say that it would be the God of this world that would be the twisted entity that is, well, you'll say twisted because he says, yeah, I genuinely coupled with her and I'm disturbed utterly. So to have completed a genuine coupling with her, I really messed up myself so bad that like I had permanent injuries forever. But if I'm a God of this world with my permanent injuries, they become my powers, because understand that he judges everyone and he judges all the couplings, including that any coupling that comes together in this world can't come in this world if it's not coupled right, which means that we don't get to even be born unless we couple right. So we spend our lives uncoupling, trying to uncouple from each other after we're born. So it's a spiritual uncoupling that we're all trying to do. So we come in, we had to spiritually and physically couple, and it had to be right because God checked it, and he says you can't be born unless it's right. So then we come in as a baby, and then we're coupled now, right? And then we spend our entire life trying to undo it, trying to get out of that truth that's good, actually, because we can't handle it, because we're all messed up, because there's a struggle between ultimately there's a struggle between the two sides, whoever they are. The feminine, the masculine, ultimately is the biggest representation of the struggle itself. Okay, so before I wrap this up, because it's about an hour, anything I'll continue, but I have lots to share in this book that I wrote that comes straight from my conversations with God. So I want to share them. Talk about getting back into society. It's important that the people that are ready to join society should be allowed immediately to get back into society and have all the privileges to be able to go with that, and understand that the entity that is God of this world says that he is seen as a ultimate scary God, which means that what he wants me to express to you is that he may be seen as maybe an evil God or a bad God, or maybe not God, but maybe something bad or evil. and he doesn't want me to say names, although you can probably figure it out. So what he's saying is that the people that are needing to rejoin society because they have something they have valuable offer to society, they need to be allowed to rejoin somehow and have all those privileges so that they can do their job. And I mean, I'm thinking of me, and I don't know if I would be saying that. If I don't know if he's talking about me or not. Ultimately, I definitely have not rejoined society yet, and I separated myself from society. But he's not talking about me specifically. He's talking about the whole population of the poor and anyone outcasted from society. Many of them need to get back into society, and he says that he is the judge on who will get back in and who will not. And ultimately, the entity that he is misunderstood, he says, because if you're not thinking he's bad and not a god and just a bad entity, then you probably won't listen to him because you'll think he is bad, and he is. So ultimately, what would he be telling us? I have the pleasure of killing people, and it's a pleasure to kill many people who refuse, yikes, to comply with repeated demands, not requests, but absolute demands. So he's talking about how God says he doesn't mind killing people. He even likes it if they're going to be just so wrong and bad they won't couple correctly, or they're coupling wrong on purpose. Which means that if people are coupled, understand that. See, this is very delicate. Understand what we have to understand is that many of us that don't deserve to die are coupled wrong, and we don't even know how to couple right. We don't even know that we're supposed to couple at all. We have no idea that it's an actual requirement for life itself, and we spend our lives trying to uncouple, or we're forced to couple as enslaved by the other half. Ultimately, what he's saying is that there's really nobody that's not extremely screwed up from it, and that goes all the way to the most sophisticated and rich people that are trying to uncouple or pretend to couple, and then they're not really doing it. Certainly, if the entity which is considered bad is really doing it, understand the implications and the nature of that kind of idea. Let's say the devil and Satan are gods of this world that were created after the human race, which means they weren't here before. There was no such thing as Satan or the devil before the human race was here. There was gods here, but understand there was other human races here that were here. So they were like humans, perhaps prior human races that were destroyed, and there were gods and goddesses, but there was no devil and Satan. There was no bad entities. There was only gods and goddesses, feminine, divine masculine, no demons, no devils, no anything bad. Well, they could be bad because any of the goddesses could be bad and any of the gods could be bad, but there was no such thing as demons or devils or any kind of bad entities before the human race was created. After the human race was created, they came into being. How they came into being is primarily a truth and subject of much debate and conflict, contention, and ultimately controversial. But if, let's say that Satan and the devil are entities that are coupling correctly, except the devil's not coupled at all. He's representing the half of Zeus, which was the beginning half. So understand that. Wow, this is long. What I'm asking is like, wow. I mean, I think it's 105, so I'm thinking I should start a new video. Maybe yes. Okay, I'll start a new one because I don't want these to go over an hour. Okay, I'll start the next one and we'll try to talk about, yeah, these gods of this world. Okay.